Sorry, I'm just standing here. Keep talking amongst yourselves. I just like to be in place so I don't, if I'm not where I'm supposed to be before I'm supposed to be there, then before I know it, I'm 5 minutes late where I'm supposed to be. Nope, nope, I'm just joking. Don't quiet down. What? I have lots of jokes. Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Hughes. I'm the faculty director of the Kleinman Center. Nice to see you all either here, and it is in fact nice to not be pretending that there are people in the audience that I'm speaking to, but actually see some smiling faces, or at least smiling eyes. Hello, Andy. And also all of you who are joining us virtually. Thank you as well for doing that. We've gotten very used to the hybrid scene and happy to have both kinds of audiences with us here today, especially for today's talk. It's a really terrific talk, but before I describe the talk, I want to welcome properly our guest, Shelley Welton from the University of South Carolina Law School, who is speaking to us today as a visiting fellow for the Kleinman Center. But next time I introduce her in the fall, I will be very happily introducing her as the Presidential Distinguished Professor of Law and Energy Policy, the most recent of the Kleinman faculty appointments funded by the Office of the President. So we are very, very excited. Congrats, Shelley, but an even bigger congrats to all of us to have this fantastic new colleague. Now, as many of you will know, one of the key debates ongoing now, even raging, is if we share a goal, and many do, of electrifying everything and of relying on electrification as the best, most efficient, potentially most equitable pathway towards decarbonization to confront the challenges of climate change, how do we do that? The questions of reliability, of the incidence of costs of transition, and so on, rage on this topic. And most of the analyses and proposals that have been applied to this challenge have focused on technological limits, have focused on the role of prices and market structures in achieving that transition towards a more reliable, robust, and much larger electric grid. Today's talk by Professor Welton is a very interesting new addition, a different kind of perspective on this, which is the more direct consideration of the way in which laws, regulations, and more fundamentally, the policy goals that those laws and regulations are attempting to achieve themselves represent very direct barriers and obstacles to the full potential of a larger, more robust, and more fully decarbonized electricity grid. This is a really new, powerful, interesting perspective on this important topic. I'm looking forward to hearing Shelley's comments on this. She'll speak for 30 or 40 minutes. We'll then have a moderated discussion of Q&A. I'll probably open up with a question or two. My colleague Angela Pachon will help in monitoring the virtual questions. We'll field as many of those as we can. And of course, any questions in the room, I will call on directly. Okay, thank you. I'll have some more housekeeping notes at the end, but I think that's all of them for now. Shelley, thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Mark, for that introduction. Thank you all so much for being here or for watching this if you're online. Oh yeah, sorry, do it. So I'm really excited to be visiting this week, but I'm even more excited that I am here for the long haul. This seems like such a wonderful, warm, dynamic, intellectual community to be entering. So thank you all very much. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about this paper. Is that going to pop up there? Awesome. Thanks, Bill.
Beautiful.
So the talk I'm going to give today is based on a paper that is a collaboration with 3 other scholars. So it's called Grid Reliability Through Clean Energy. The analysis is the product of a series of conversations and research with Alexandra Klass, who's at the University of Minnesota, Josh Macy at University of Chicago, and Hannah Wiseman, who is at Penn State. So the stuff that you like in this presentation is probably out of our shared collective analysis. Whatever I say that's wrong is probably just me saying it today. So I want to start by taking us back just over a year ago. This was late February 2021, and there was a Winter Storm Uri, that brought unusually frigid temperatures to the middle of the US. It hit places like Texas that really aren't accustomed to this kind of weather particularly hard. So families across the state are doing whatever they can to stay warm. In Texas, a lot of families rely on electricity for heat, so that meant really skyrocketing electricity demand. But the problem wasn't just surging demand. There were also major challenges on the supply side of the system. Power plants were shutting off, they were incapacitated by frozen equipment, and an inability to obtain their primary fuel source, which was natural gas. And the natural gas shortage, in turn, came from frozen equipment in that system. So both pipelines and drilling equipment that froze. Now, grid operators hoped they'd be able to do what's called a controlled load shed, where they basically rotated blackouts around the state, but the system collapsed too quickly and too thoroughly, and ultimately it left 11 million Texans freezing in the dark for as long as 3 days. And I just want to pause for a moment on the very severe, real human consequences of this disaster. So many of those who didn't have power could not find adequate ways to heat themselves, and they died of hypothermia, of carbon monoxide poisoning from running generators indoors, of medical complications that came from not being able to power their life-saving medical equipment, and of fires caused by the use of unsafe fireplaces to produce heat. In total, the death count ranged somewhere between Texas's official state total of 246 and expert estimates of up to 700 people. Now, those people that didn't lose power in Texas suffered in different ways. So just to give you an example, this is a New York Times profile of a man named Scott Willoughby, who was a 63-year-old Army veteran who lives on Social Security payments in a Dallas suburb. He said he'd nearly emptied his savings account so he'd be able to pay the $16,752 electric bill that was charged to his credit card as a result of this storm. That's 70 times what he usually pays for all of his utilities combined. And he said, there's nothing I can do about it, but it's broken me. And these enormous bills are due to a feature of the Texas electricity system that lets some residential consumers have exposure to price spikes in the wholesale electricity market. In addition to these challenges, there were other cascading consequences to the blackouts. Millions either lost water or they needed to boil their water. When the water finally came back on, lots of pipes burst and caused billions of dollars in damages. Ultimately, economists at the Dallas Federal Reserve estimated that these blackouts cost the state's economy somewhere in the $80 to $130 billion range, which would make it the most expensive disaster ever in state history. So there have been a lot of retrospectives in the last 12 months trying to figure out what caused the Texas blackouts. I'm not going to go deep into the details here, but in brief, there are a few major contributing factors. Part of it was that they misforecast total demand. So they had planned for around 67 gigawatts of peak demand. Demand topped out at around 70 gigawatts. So slightly higher than they had ever planned for. But much more significant was around 30 gigawatts of failed generation. That's a staggering amount of capacity to lose off of a system that was projected at its height to be around 67. And Texas's grid operator had only ever planned for half as much power to be out as went out together at the same time last February. And I'll just note, some wind turbines in the state did freeze, but these are already heavily derated in an event like this. So the Texas grid operators weren't counting on a ton of wind, and they didn't get a ton of wind. They were counting on around 1,500 megawatts of wind, and they maybe ended up like 1,000 megawatts short. What they were really counting on was around 67,000 megawatts of firm capacity. And this capacity failed largely because it wasn't winterized. It wasn't weatherized to withstand this kind of storm. And because the equipment that was necessary to get, particularly natural gas, to these plants also wasn't weatherized. And so they couldn't deliver fuel. Now that's because Texas regulators had chosen to make winterization a voluntary requirement instead of a mandatory feature of the system. So despite these expert findings regarding causation, what we got out of Texas leaders following the storm was largely an insistence that renewable energy was to blame. So for example, here's a quote from Texas Agricultural Commissioner after the February 2021 blackout, who said, "We should never build another wind turbine in Texas." That was his takeaway. And as you can see from the several pictures I've put over on your right-hand side, this is a narrative that quickly caught hold in certain media circles. Now, these are maybe the most egregious examples of this kind of rhetoric, but this is not a sentiment that is limited to far-right politicians. So this is also turning up in much more mainstream arguments in much more influential players in grid management. So here, for example, I have a quote that comes from the head of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. That is basically the main organization that's in charge of creating reliability standards for the North American grid. And the quote says, "Environmental regulations are shown to be the #1 risk to reliability over the next 1 to 5 years." This is a quote from several years ago. "In recent reports, NERC has continued to lean into the narrative that renewable energy presents a real threat for grid reliability, a threat that needs to be managed." So the goal of this project is really to do 3 things. One of the things we want to do is we want to rebut this growing argument that entrenching fossil fuels is the right way to get a reliable grid. And the key point that we want to make is that, as Mark indicated in his introduction, oftentimes we talk about this as a technical problem, right? Like, do we have the technical tools we need? Do we have the technologies we need in order to make the grid reliable? And our core argument is that actually the challenge is equally or largely, or even maybe more largely, a challenge of law and governance. And so this is our different diagnosis of why we think that reliability and clean energy are often pitted against one another. And our core point that we want to make is that the fragmented institutions that we've created to dictate the configuration of the electric grid, right? So that's the generation plants and the transmission lines and the distribution lines that carry power to consumers. This system that we've created of institutions substantially impedes the rapid transition to clean energy that we could achieve while also keeping the lights on. And so our focus is really both to illustrate and to theorize how policy and governance emerge as key hurdles to creating a grid that systematically embraces renewable energy and also maintains or maybe even enhances the reliability of the grid. And then finally, based on that diagnosis, we offer several proposals of how we might modify the energy policy system to achieve more renewables and greater reliability. Okay, so here's what I want to do with this talk today. I'll say a few words about grid decarbonization and the idea of reliability more generally. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the key players in energy law for those who aren't really deep in the field already. And I'm going to introduce this concept that we work with about the siloization of energy law, or the ways in which we sort of fragment how we plan the grid across several different facets that I'll go into. And then finally, I'm going to link this concept of silos with some of the really important policy areas for getting to the place where we can have both a clean and a reliable grid. So let's start with decarbonization. So scientists widely agree. If we're going to have a chance of limiting planetary warming to non-catastrophic levels, we need to basically have emissions by around 2030. That's 8 years from now and get to a point of net zero emissions by around 2050. And to oversimplify slightly, at least the situation, the strategy for doing so can largely be reduced to these two words that Mark also said during his introduction: electrify everything. So transportation, heating, fuels production, even parts of heavy industry are counting on electricity as the means that they're going to get the carbon out of their systems. Now, of course, that only works if you also decarbonize the grid. So for that reason, electricity's role in responding to climate change is really outsized. It's been described as the linchpin of decarbonization. And the heavy reliance on electricity as our climate change strategy also means that the system is going to need to approximately triple in size by 2050, at the same time that it reduces emissions 95 to 100%. Now, I'll note an increasing number of states are adopting laws that are very much in line with the climate science. And the Biden administration has also adopted a net zero by 2050 policy, at least by executive order. And what we're going to need to accomplish these goals is, to oversimplify again a bit, 3 big things. We're going to need a lot more clean generation. We're going to need a lot more transmission to move that generation to people. And we're going to need a lot more coordination to make this very different looking system function. All right, so I next want to turn and just give a little introduction to grid reliability, especially under these changing conditions facing the system. So as we conceptualize it, grid reliability really has 3 distinct elements. So first, reliability is about the process of ensuring that there's always enough electricity generation on the system to meet electricity demand at any given time. Now, if you fail to exactly match electricity supply and electricity demand on an instantaneous basis, you can end up with under or over voltages, and ultimately that can lead to blackouts or the complete loss of power. So that's short-term reliability. But this short-term planning can only go so far. Ensuring reliability also requires longer-term planning. After all, we're talking about building big infrastructure. It takes a lot of foresight, money, financing, siting to get built. And so when we talk about reliability, we're also talking about this long-term planning that's also often called resource adequacy, or making sure that we are planning to build enough infrastructure to confront whatever the rising demand is projected to be into the future. Okay, and then third, for purposes of this project, we also intend for grid reliability to encompass this sort of emerging concept of resilience, or this idea that we want the grid to be able to bounce back quickly after power disruptions caused by weather or other emergencies. And we want it to be able to prevent blackouts during these emergencies. So I want to just emphasize here that there's no doubt that when we move to a grid that's fueled by clean energy, and in particular a grid that's fueled by substantial quantities of renewable energy, it's going to pose different reliability challenges than a grid that's made up of fossil fuels. And whereas fossil fuels can often decrease and increase production rapidly, like ramp is what the word is in industry terminology, wind and solar generation are of course only available when the wind blows, when the sun shines. So everybody knows this, right? It's not like some big secret that engineers have not been thinking about as we've been designing this system. Instead, a lot of people that are on the technical side of the system have been working for years to figure out how do you maintain reliability under a changing resource mix. And this work shows that it can be technically done even with very high penetration of renewable energy. So I pulled you just 2 quotes from 2 studies, one a little bit older, one a little bit newer here on this point. This first one comes from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and a 2012 study in which they found renewable electricity generation from technologies that are commercially available today, in combination with a more flexible electric system, is more than adequate to supply 80% of total US electricity generation in 2050, while meeting electricity demand on an hourly basis in every region of the United States. I also pulled a more recent study. This one is out of Berkeley, and their bottom line was the United States can deliver 90% clean carbon-free electricity nationwide by 2035 dependably at no extra cost to consumer bills and without the need for new fossil fuel plants. All right, so the upshot of all of this is the technical know-how is there to support rapid decarbonization that's fueled mostly through growth in renewable energy. Now this gets us to 80 or 90%. We have a lot of other people working very hard on that last 10 to 20% and figuring out how you can get that through clean methods as well. And there are a bunch of promising technologies out there for this, from long duration energy storage to next generation nuclear to non-variable renewable resources to carbon capture and storage. All of this, we contend, suggests that the key problem that we're facing, at least in the ramp from where we are now to largely getting to a clean grid, is not a technical problem. The other point I want to make about grid reliability is that making this kind of transition that they say is possible is really the only way to ensure a reliable grid over the long term. Climate change is already wreaking havoc on social systems and on the electricity grid. I think if anybody saw headlines about the report that came out yesterday from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it made it ever more clear that we are a set of social and infrastructural systems on the brink right now. And I could have picked numerous disasters other than Texas to open this presentation with. It's not a one-off incident. It's a sign of the increasing consequences that climate change is having in exacerbating both the nature and the frequency of storms and other extreme weather. And I'll just note, one report from Bloomberg New Energy Finance recently found that extreme weather events may cost utilities alone in the United States $4 billion per year as climate change intensifies. The Washington Post at the same time found that nearly 1 in 3 of us has personally experienced the impacts of a natural disaster in the last year. So it's here, it's mounting, it's a serious challenge, and we cannot simply retrench or double down on fossil fuels as a strategy because they're not capable of creating a reliable, resilient grid going forward. Okay, so let me just offer a couple of caveats about our analysis before I sort of jump into the meat of it. So first, our project mostly focuses on renewable energy for a couple reasons. First, it's projected to play the largest role in building out a clean energy grid in the coming decades. And second, it's the resource that's most often cast as a threat to reliability. We do not mean by focusing on this to suggest that it's the only important clean energy resource out there. And the second caveat I want to offer is that we don't say a lot here about very small scale resources like rooftop solar, household energy efficiency. Not because these aren't important, they definitely are, but because our analysis relating to governance silos is less directly applicable to these resources, and because even if we do all of these kind of distributed energy resources that are possible, we're still likely to need large systemic reforms. Okay, so with those caveats, let me move now to our argument about energy silos as a key challenge to a clean, reliable grid. I'm going to start with an introduction to some of the big players in the system for people that aren't already like neck deep in here. So this is a graphic from our paper that charts some of the key players in the system along 2 dimensions. Does this little pointer work? Okay, no. All right, so you can see that there's state to federal going from left to right, and then public to private going from top to bottom. We've already talked about NERC, which is in our chart here. And I want to just spend a minute talking about highlighting 4 of the other key institutional players in this space that you really need to understand in order to sort of track our analysis. So the first I want to focus on is investor-owned public utilities. These are the kinds of utilities that deliver power to 2/3 of US households. For example, PECO here in Philadelphia. These are shareholder-controlled companies, but they're under regulatory oversight because they're given monopoly service territories. So we often call them regulated monopolies. And the key regulators of these regulated monopolies are state public utility commissions. These are charged with making sure that utilities' rates and practices are just and reasonable. States also are given control in the system over the types of electricity generation that their utilities either build or buy. However, the grid is now extremely interconnected, very much interstate, which means that state level governance doesn't work for a lot of issues. Consequently, Congress has given the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, control over interstate transmission and interstate wholesale sales of electricity, or that's sales between utilities. We're talking about wholesale sales. And FERC, in turn, has delegated a lot of the day-to-day responsibility for managing this system and running electricity markets to regional transmission organizations, or RTOs, which are not-for-profits that are basically comprised of all of the interested members, industry members within a region. Okay, so as you can imagine, this kind of complex, multi-dimensional system has resulted in some challenges. And in particular, our argument is that this system is overly siloed or divided and separated in some problematic ways along 3 different lines. So I'm going to describe the 3 silos first, and then I'll come back and give several examples of how each works. The first major silo that we talk about is substantive. So there's a divide in energy governance between those actors that are in charge of clean energy and those actors that are in charge of reliability. Second major silo is jurisdictional. Sorry, these slides ended up a little wonky, but you get the idea. So jurisdictional, often the entity that's best situated from a substantive point of view to implement some particular policy does not have the legal authority to do so. And then the third set of silos is between public and private entities. So government agencies on the one hand, and corporations and hybrid kinds of constructs on the other hand. The electricity sector has a lot of the hallmarks of what's often called deregulatory or new governance theory in its modern design. So you have several not-for-profit, member-dominated organizations that are making decisions in this space, including both RTOs and NERC, alongside traditional public actors like the state and federal commissions that I was just talking about. Okay, so our core argument in this piece is that this kind of segmentation of energy policy is an underdiagnosed cause of the perceived clash between clean energy on the one hand and reliability on the other hand. And in particular, you often see private reliability-oriented organizations counteract clean energy policies, sometimes inadvertently, other times more deliberately, when they're making decisions about how to keep the lights on. At the same time, legal silos often cause states and regional organizations to neglect valuable opportunities for collaboration. So we view overcoming this kind of structural separation that prevents the establishment of a clean, reliable grid as a critical precondition to the kind of rapid progress that we need on decarbonization here in the United States. So I want to focus the second half of my remarks on thinking about how this plays out across 4 really important areas of energy policy for the clean energy transition. So I'm going to talk about electricity markets, transmission, reliability regulation, and RTO governance. So let's start with electricity markets. The system that we have today for managing the electricity grid is comprised of a series of markets that sell both electricity and related products. I am not going to go into the details of these markets unless any of you want to invite me there. So what I want to point out for now about this system is that it's a system that's very much in flux. Here's a super overfied, simple schematic of what the system looks like in most of our heads. Right, you have big generators, they make the power, they send it through transmission lines, it goes to smaller distribution lines, and then we get all of our power into our houses. So right now, this is a system that's made up mostly of fossil fuels here in the United States. But in addition to this sort of traditional one-directional flow, we have a lot of resources in here that are now cropping up on what's traditionally been the load side of this system. Right, so we have things like demand response, cutting of energy at peak times, energy efficiency, trying to save energy. We have solar panels, we have battery storage. Increasingly, we have electric vehicles that are all entering the system on the demand side of the equation, or what used to be demand side of the equation. At the same time, we also have these aggressive state policies and real changes in renewable economics that mean that we're seeing a lot more renewable energy enter the system on the supply side of the equation. Okay, so the basic challenge that this changing system presents to the markets that I was just talking about are that these electricity markets, the rules that these markets have to govern how people participate in them, have systematically undervalued or walled off from participation resources that don't have operating characteristics that look like these big power plants that we're used to. And in some regions, these markets have also walled off, quote, state-supported resources on the theory that somehow these are illegitimate competitors in the market because states are supporting their creation. Now, one way to understand what's going on here is to return to this silos frame. So you might think of this problem as stretching across all three of the silos that we've identified. Jurisdictionally, you have authority split between states who control generation and are promoting clean energy through entirely legal state policies, and the federal government, which controls these markets. Substantively, you've got a divide between those who value clean energy and those who see clean energy or state-supported energy as a potential threat to the functioning of these markets and the grid. And I just want to pause and note on this point that experts pretty widely agree that the best way to integrate a really high level of variable renewable energy into our system while making sure that we maintain reliability is to create flexibility, to reward resources that are really good at balancing the variability in renewable energy. But to date, a lot of RTOs have proven resistant to updating their concept of reliability to embrace flexibility as sort of the key characteristic that we should be designing these markets to reward. And indeed, a lot of RTOs have resisted incorporating a host of more flexible resources into their energy, ancillary services, and capacity markets that they run. Now, in terms of the public-private divide, you can kind of start to understand why maybe RTOs are doing this. RTOs write the rules of these markets in the first instance. These are primarily made up of member incumbents who maybe wouldn't jump at the chance to revise their rules and their markets to be more accommodating of new entrants who are, after all, also competitors. So breaking down these silos, we suggest also points some ways forward. Jurisdictionally, we have states acting entirely legally, which means that it's inappropriate and also quite inefficient to let market design subordinate state preferences. Instead, we suggest state goals need to be integrated into how we design electricity markets. And FERC, as the key regulator of these market operators, needs to assert a firmer hand in making sure that the public-private divide doesn't thwart legitimate public policy objectives. And we think markets are good and efficient ways to secure necessary resources, but we need to be buying and paying for the right features in these markets. Okay, so let me move to my second example, which is transmission, planning, siting, and financing. And here experts agree that one key to a clean grid is to build many more high voltage, long distance transmission lines. So for example, I just pulled you here, this is one proposal of how this system might look that again comes from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. The basic idea is we need to find ways to connect parts of the country that have really good wind and solar resources with parts of the country that have energy demand that's not being met. And the challenge here is that it's been incredibly difficult to get states and regions to agree to finance, site, and pay for these lines. And the silo frame, again, helps us understand why. So jurisdictionally, states control transmission siting, but they don't reap a lot of the benefits of these lines, or sometimes even any of the benefits, right? You might have a line that passes through a state from a windy area to a coastal state without that state actually seeing any of the benefits, and potentially even with the state having to use eminent domain to take the property of their residents and site this transmission line. And in terms of the public-private divide, FERC has already been working hard to tell RTOs that they have to incorporate state policies into their planning. It's a good step. It starts to break down this sort of substantive divide between those who care about clean energy and those who care about reliability. But it's proven really hard for regions to come to some sort of agreement about who gets to build these lines and who has to pay for them. This is a challenge that's often known as cost allocation in the industry. So in order to reap maximum benefit, what utilities prefer is to build small lines that are within their own service territories, rather than basically pitch in ratepayer funding to build large lines that they don't get to own, even if their customers do benefit from these larger long distance lines. And because RTO membership is voluntary, utilities will often threaten to walk away from an RTO if the rules prove too unfavorable to them. So what to do? Here, I will note that commendably, the present FERC is already working hard to find some ways around this challenge. They have formed a joint federal state task force on electric transmission. It's a good first step. We're somewhat skeptical. We are varying degrees of optimistic within the people working on this project as to whether or not a task force is a sufficient solution, but it's a good first step. The Infrastructure Act that passed in the fall also gave FERC some more authority to basically override states that are refusing to cite a line through their territory. Now that is a politically fraught thing for FERC to do. So we'll see whether or not it's willing to ever actually act on that authority. We suggest though that even if they don't go that far, this is one area where federalizing more control would go a long way. And so we suggest that FERC might think about doing some sort of national transmission planning authority here, which even if they didn't then force states to participate, national plans could guide regional plans with the presumption that FERC wouldn't approve regional plans as just and reasonable if they didn't somehow help address national priorities. So just sort of like cleverly using some of their existing legal hooks, FERC, we think, could go a fair distance towards helping build out a more national grid. Finally, I'll just note one other idea here is that FERC could pivot from acting like a regulator in this space to acting more like a proprietor. There is some authority from the Energy Policy Act of 2005 that says that federal power marketing authorities can go in and build long distance transmission lines without having to go through state siting processes. And so if we were to think of the government role in a different light and use different tools, maybe we could at least in some regions get some of this transmission built. Okay, so two more things to cover quickly. One is reliability regulation and the other is grid governance. So when it comes to governing reliability, NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, is the key player. So NERC writes and administers standards with extensive assistance from regional subsets of the organization called regional entities, and with some oversight from FERC. And then owners and operators of power plants and transmission lines and distribution lines have to then comply with these standards. Now, NERC has traditionally taken a light touch approach to reliability regulation. So for example, in the wake of several storms that occurred throughout the first 2 decades of the 2000s, we saw that it would clearly have been wise in many of these instances to weatherize plants. But NERC opted to maintain a voluntary weatherization standard rather than decide to propose a mandatory one. The other challenge is that NERC has been quite slow to recognize the potential reliability benefits of renewables. So for example, very localized generation can be key during widespread outages, but it's not valued in NERC's reliability standards. NERC has even written a report that discusses the reliability threats of distributed energy without sort of having this attendant recognition that it can do really good things for reliability as well. So if we return to the lens of silos, we might think about 2 big silos at play here. Substantively, NERC does not have a clean energy mandate, and so it has limited reason to work hard to recognize and value the benefits of renewables to the grid. And then in terms of this public-private divide, what we have here is a not-for-profit made up of industry regulating the same industry. So anything that NERC does directly imposes costs on its members. Now, industry involvement in writing these kinds of standards is obviously important. No one knows their equipment, the challenges the equipment faces better than industry insiders. But the public importance of reliability, particularly under changing conditions, we suggest means that we need more attention from the top to this issue. FERC, as sort of the entity with the most comprehensive view here, should probably be doing more searching oversight of NERC's work and has some ability to do this under existing law. and perhaps think about whether reforms to NERC's governance are in order in light of the changes that are happening on the system. Okay, so the final policy topic is regional grid governance. You have here a map of the various regions and their RTOs in the country. I'm going to set aside discussion of the Northwest and the Southeast, which do not have regional grid governors. We can come back to them in the Q&A if you want. But for now, I'm going to focus on those areas of the country that have these regional organizations that run markets, share and transmission planning, et cetera. So I want to start by noting that regional grid management can be a really good thing. And it's going to become ever more important if we care about clean energy and reliability. At their best, RTOs are technically skilled grid managers that basically work to balance the objectives of FERC and the objectives of the state and the needs of all the industry stakeholders to come up with regional harmony. That's sort of an ideal vision. However, many of the concerns that I've been talking about so far, especially market and transmission related challenges, can be traced to a core feature of how regional governance is designed today. Again, these are private membership clubs that are making decisions about how markets should be designed, what transmission projects should be built, and the rules for resources, new resources connecting to the grid, all under somewhat cabined FERC oversight. Sometimes this works really well, right? So like the Midwest did a program supporting multi-value transmission projects that turned out to have great benefits for the region. But often it creates real and costly tensions. So much so that in recent years, several states with ambitious clean energy goals have threatened to withdraw from these regional markets because they say they're not serving their democratically determined, completely legitimate policy goals related to climate change. And if we think regionalization is a good thing, we have to come up with some sort of system where both the states and the industry players want in. So we suggest that this challenge is somewhat a result of silos again. In part, it's a jurisdictional mismatch. Again, states are supposed to be able to control what gets built within their borders, but regional rules end up dictating outcomes in a lot of areas. And you can see this as, again, a public-private tension as well. So the institutional interests of RTO members don't necessarily align with democratically established goals for the system, either in terms of FERC's goals, which is running a really efficient grid, or in terms of state goals of promoting increasing amounts of clean and renewable energy. So solutions here might focus on two types of reforms. One set of reforms I'm going to just call internal reforms, which is to say you could look within RTOs, ask how do they make decisions, and find some ways to give more authority to new entrants or state participants. The second set of reforms is external. You could decide to give either FERC or the states more authority to basically control what decisions come out of these regional processes. In either case, the key point that I want to make is that rethinking the structure of who has power to make rules and not just the substance of the rules themselves is a critical precondition to getting kind of an enduring system in place for grid transformation. Okay, so that brings me to the end of this tour through how the structure of US energy law and governance is impeding a successful transition to both a clean and reliable grid. And some initial thoughts we have about how you might begin to restructure this system to make it work more collaboratively. I want to close by emphasizing one more time the equity implications of restructuring energy governance to embrace this dual challenge. I will admit, as you all have no doubt realized over the last 30 odd minutes, that these discussions can get deeply technocratic really quickly. It can be hard to trace a line from discussions of things like wholesale electricity market design to their real human and social consequences. But throughout these necessarily technical conversations, I think it's really important to keep front of mind that failure to jointly pursue these goals of clean energy and reliability creates not just substantial economic costs, but real and unequal human costs. Right, so low-income communities and communities of color shoulder the bulk of the burdens caused by the fossil fuel system that we have. They inhale most of the air pollution from fossil fuel fired facilities, and they toil in the dangerous conditions of fossil fuel production industries. These same communities struggle the most to pay their bills, and therefore are most in need of efficient collaborative solutions. And they're most burdened by reliability issues because they are disproportionately hit by blackouts. And they're the hardest hit by severe weather events as well, because they lack many of the resources necessary to withstand and recover from these disasters. So although grid reforms are infrequently discussed or justified on equity grounds, it's worth emphasizing that these kinds of reforms that make the grid cleaner and more reliable also will reduce costly redundancies between climate and reliability policies and help us chart a course towards a safer and more equitable climate and energy future. Okay, I will close there. I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Shelley. That was terrific. And you know, before your justice coda there at the end, actually, I was going to say that that was technocratic indeed, but that was the best case for a technocratic analysis I've seen in a long time, because it was full of zealous pragmatism, right, about solving these problems. And so I thought it was, you know, it was technocratic with a purpose. So that was really terrific.
Okay, good.
Bill, does like the Zoom like go off at 1 o'clock? Does it like shut down? I mean, how hard does this stop? 1:30. Oh, at 1:30. Oh, good. I'm going to ask the first question then. I was wondering whether I was going to have to give it up. So, you know, you said a couple of things that I think speak to this, but I want to zoom right in on the substantive silo with a question here. A lot of what you were kind of laying out for us today reminded me kind of again and again about the raging debate between social cost of carbon and marginal abatement cost as kind of competing approaches to a lot of the climate policy formation, right? And so, you know, on the one hand, you've got social cost of carbon, which is talking about benefit cost and the damage function. So you have a set of assumptions and arithmetic there. And then on the marginal abatement cost, you've got, you know, you're starting with the science-based climate goals about the temperature limits and a bunch of assumptions and arithmetic there. I tend, full disclosure, if I'm gonna have to choose between the math of physicists and the math of economists, I'm gonna choose the math of the physicists every time. And so I'm a little more sympathetic to the marginal abatement cost, but the ace in the hole for the social cost of carbon advocates is the way the benefit cost test is enshrined in so much US law as a necessary hurdle for spending. And I'm wondering, or as I'm sympathetic to some of your kind of nuanced approach to trying to do a combination of top down and bottom up, the who question before the what question for the durable, which I think is a very important consideration. But how far do you think this agenda can get without a clear policy signal on the substance that climate change and climate policy goals have to be the priority driver, even if it appears to conflict with anything else, like even reliability, right? And I agree that it doesn't really, but just settle the question with a clear policy goal update on these things. How far do you think you can get without that?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question for our political moment, right? Because it does not seem, I mean, even with a Biden administration that has embraced the goals of addressing climate, they really haven't been able to get anything through Congress that resembles the kind of mandate that you're talking about. That would be a clear statement from the top, right? Even Build Back Better is really like throwing money at the problem at this point in its current frame. Even if it were to pass, I don't think it would be that. It would help, it would go a long way towards helping, but it wouldn't create that sort of like baseline federal policy that like, we are on the road to decarbonization and nothing can stop us. So I do think that creates, I mean, that sort of sets up the tension that we're talking about, right? Like FERC is not an environmental regulator at its core. We have a chair of FERC that has embraced environmental goals to the extent they don't conflict with the mission. And I would say that some of FERC's goals are really broad, right? Like create just and reasonable system. I've seen people argue that you could import environmental concerns into that, at least in as much as you could make the case that planning down the road for the future and building fossil fuel infrastructure that's likely to face stranded costs is not a just and reasonable use of current dollars, right? So like, could you get creative as a regulator that has an economic mission? Maybe. You're working in a judicial climate that's not super open to creative interpretations or even just normal interpretations of statutory language. So I think that brings us to the question of like, is efficiency in conflict with clean energy goals? And FERC's position, at least so far, has largely been clean energy enhances efficiency as well, right? Things like more resources entering the markets bring down the costs of electricity and related services. And so like, there's a lot of ways in which what you need to do to have an efficient grid and what you need to do to have a clean grid are actually very much in concert at the moment, maybe more so than they ever have been, right? Like the economics of clean energy have shifted in some ways that I think make this dynamic less problematic than it has been in the past. There are many ways to both enhance efficiency and tackle clean energy. I do think though, like you're bringing up the fact that at some point, if clean energy obviously makes the grid more expensive, then you start to see more of this tension happen. And we may hit that at some point on the road to 100%, but we're not going to hit it soon, which I do think is good news.
Great, terrific, terrific. Angela, do we have a cue from the world? And also, can I see hands from people who have questions they'd like to get on? And one from Andy. Do we? Is it long and good or long and? Okay. Should I just read it? It's this one, right? Yeah. Okay, and then Andy, you're next. So we have a mic ready. Okay, can you please elaborate? We could probably read this together.
Okay.
While I read it for the group, you can be reading it. Can you please elaborate on where the quote reliability advantage close quote of renewables comes from that you mentioned several times? You introduced the talk with the Texas example, 3 days of ice cold weather, almost no sun, almost no wind. I understand that regional transmission management and decentralized generation can help to push for more renewables on normal days. But where does that renewable reliability advantage for worst case weather come from? Gas plants, wells, pipelines can be winterized, but I cannot switch on sun or wind. Is the claim that building large scale storage multi-day would be cheaper than paying the carbon related cost of flexible fossil fuel?
Okay, I mean, this is a great and like very nuanced question. I mean, the claim is not that in every weather condition, renewables are going to be like a solid backup source when other parts of the grid aren't available. The reliability advantage that some people have pointed to is that when you're talking about a system that goes down, like I think a really good example of this is after Hurricane Ida in New Orleans this past fall, another weather disaster that I could have focused on but didn't. You had some areas in New Orleans where solar panels were able to basically carry communities through a really difficult time. And they weren't necessarily powering every AC in the city, but they were providing essentially hubs where people could go to cool off, to recharge their cell phones, to in some cases like bring and refrigerate things that they had to have refrigerated. So particularly when you're thinking about community coping mechanisms in the face of a disaster that takes the grid down, localized renewables can be a really good way to maintain some pockets of livability in a grid that's otherwise not serving the population. Microgrids too can be a really important tool here that we did not focus on in the piece, but basically stringing together a set of resources that's capable of islanding from the larger grid for some portion of time is definitely an important theory going forward about how you begin to tackle some of these acute vulnerabilities. Now, we clearly need some other resources to come into the mix to make renewables the kind of moonshot that we hope that they're going to be, including maybe long duration storage, which is not cheaper than fossil right now. But I think there's a lot of promise for ways that we could back up renewables that that would allow us to escape from having to turn to fossils that are themselves inherently not particularly reliable during a lot of disasters.
Even though the sun was shining or the wind wasn't blowing in Texas, the sun was shining in Arizona, the wind was blowing in Oklahoma, but because Texas didn't have the transmission that
Okay, this is another really great point, right? Like one of the things that people have said about reasons for the Texas disaster is that because Texas has decided to functionally island itself from the rest of the United States to avoid federal jurisdiction. And so I think one open question is, had Texas decided to interconnect with its neighbors, would that have been enough to basically allow electricity to be imported from other places and smooth out some of the big fluctuations they were facing? Maybe. So I've seen some analysis that the Midwestern grid and the Southwestern power pool were able to do some resource sharing that made the disaster much less severe for them. So to the extent that you have renewables development coupled with this long distance transmission, as long as you're not seeing an enormous swath of the country face the same disaster at the same time, that also I think is a really good point in terms of tools that you can use to make sure that renewables are able to perform this reliability function.
Andy, you're up. Here, Mike, wait for that mic though.
Hi, I'm Andy Humler from the engineering school. First off, welcome to Penn. Really thrilled
Thank
to have
you.
you join us. And just to demonstrate how excited I am, I have 3 questions for
Okay.
you today.
Let's start with that first one.
Okay, first one. They're all good. First one, you talked about reforming the governance process of RTOs, and I'm really interested in how you would do that for new entrants. I have sat through maybe hundreds of RTO meetings. I don't do it anymore to save my sanity. But you know, the cost of entrance is so high. Just the fact of hiring an expert to bring your technology is so difficult. So I'm curious about what you think about that. Second question, how does a state or a utility withdraw from an RTO? I've heard about this, and my immediate response is, you know, go for it, but don't plan on coming back anytime soon. And then the third question is, I don't know if you follow this, but could you talk about the long distance transmission in northern New England? The states in southern New England have very strong climate goals, legislated climate goals, and New England has been trying to get power in from Hydro-Quebec. It's been defeated in Vermont, defeated in New Hampshire, and now there's a referendum against it in Maine. So how do you see that playing out? That's a fascinating one.
Yeah, oh, those are great questions. Reforming governance vis-a-vis new entrants, RTO governance in particular. So I think the sort of quirky thing about how RTOs run, for those who have not had the pleasure of sitting through many of their meetings, is that they operate on this principle of weighted sectoral voting. So various sectors, different in various RTOs, get different amounts of voting power, basically, when they're deciding how to make a new rule. The plan that I've heard of for basically empowering new entrants is that, so the challenge in a lot of these RTO governance processes is that you have like a generation sector, basically. And all of the new entrants are getting lumped into the generation sector, and they're voting with all of the old entrants. So one of the ideas is you might carve out something like a clean energy sector or a renewables sector that sort of shifts how you're doing weighted voting within the system. So not so much about, it doesn't solve your meeting problem. The meetings are still painful, but the idea is you'd give more structural power to new entrants who are seeing their power diluted because of how these rules are set up. Withdrawal from RTOs. The one successful case of withdrawal that I've seen is not actually withdrawal, but transfer, right? So you've seen a few utilities successfully play off one RTO against another to say, I don't like your rules, MISO, I'll join you, PJM, which is the RTO that governs this part of the country, because you're kinder to what you're more sympathetic to the arguments that I'm making about how the system should be structured. So I think that's the easiest way for a utility to play that game, is to jump around rather than completely exit. States talking about exiting RTOs, I think the question is it a grand bluff, right? Would a state actually be willing to take back over all the functions that their RTO currently plays and basically go it alone when we know that the costs of that are really high? you've seen states now sort of like back away from that, but I think the mere fact that they can is kind of like a background leverage position that they like to use. The other thing that states could do that I think they more seriously considered is you could basically demand some of your authority back from the RTO without exiting. Right? So particularly this is an issue around resource adequacy. In the Eastern markets, we basically run markets that decide what gets built in the future. You've seen some states say, like, I don't want to leave you, RTO, but I want more control over what gets built. I want my resource adequacy authority back, or I want to determine resource adequacy regionally, but outside of your markets. So I think that kind of threat is actually a much more plausible threat than the full exit, which I agree is maddeningly complex to figure out how it would go down in reality. The long distance transmission in New England. Yeah, this is actually the subject of a future paper that I want to work on, which, I think the challenge here is that democracy can be great for clean energy and democracy can be bad for clean energy. And I mean, one way to understand what's going on is these same state parochial interests are getting involved and they don't want the pass-through lines. I do not know enough about the political economy of this story to give you a full answer, but as it's been explained to me, the political economy of who's opposed and who's in favor, including clean energy generation in New England being opposed, is part of the story. And so I can't really satisfactorily answer that, except to say I think it's a story that merits our attention in terms of thinking through silos and democratic power and how you want to structure these systems to sort of avoid some of the worst pathologies while getting some of the benefits.
Great. Yeah, 3 great questions, 3 great answers. I've got another virtual question here, but following up on your last 2 answers, I just wanted to ask a small follow-up, which is the basis, the historical and kind of continuing basis for regional market structure of the RTOs. Is that weakening in a way where instead of looking down to the states, we might look up to larger scale that could try to address some of these, kind of a scale change might be accompanied by a lot of efficiency stuff, right?
Yeah.
Is there anything happening in
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, right? Like we sort of arrived at the regional scale, not by happenstance, but by matter of history. So we had utilities that were already cooperating and forming these power pools in a bunch of regions of the country. And FERC came along and decided that we wanted to make these markets and make everyone cooperate more. And they just kind of used the power pools that existed. And there's a couple of RTOs that you saw on the map that are, oh, I can't do that anymore, can I?
Yeah, you can if Bill comes up here and changes.
No, it's fine. Just you can think back to that map that you imprinted in your mind. There are a few RTOs that are single state RTOs. So New York and California decided not to get together with their neighbors. And you do see some pressure being put on that system. So California has now formed one particular market with several of its neighbors to try and smooth out renewable energy fluctuations. And you see a lot of talk about whether or not it makes sense to go sort of more whole hog with the regional market there. The governance issues are front and center in that debate, though. The real question is like, who gets to have control? Who has decision-making authority? California does not want to give up its clean energy goals in order to play nice with its neighbors. And so I don't think those tensions with state control are ever going to go away as long as we have an overarching statutory structure that gives states control over generation. And I do not see that changing anytime soon. So I think that the pressures for regionalization are real and important. Getting governance questions right is like going to determine whether or not it happens or not.
Great, thoughtful, nuanced answer. Terrific. So this is one from I'm happy to say, our colleague, Carrie Colonese. Great talk, Shelley. How does a regulator, whether FERC or an RTO, mandate something like reliability? Quote, reliability. Can the regulator expect sensibly to specify exactly what measures to take in a complex system where the utility has more knowledge of its operations than do government? Are performance standards viable? If so, how would performance be defined?
Oh man, that's
That's a great question.
That's a great one too. So I mean, I think the system that we have now recognizes a lot of the nuances that Carrie's getting at, which is to say, right now we have NERC use committees comprised of industry insiders to write these standards in the first instance. The membership votes on whether or not to adopt a particular standard, and then the board decides whether or not to propose it to FERC. So, I mean, the structure now very much recognizes that we're going to have very detailed inside information to figure out how to manage this challenge. I guess the question is, do we want to see FERC get more involved and more heavy-handed than they have so far, at least in sort of dictating what kinds of considerations NERC needs to have demonstrated it took into account to prove that its reliability standards are really just and reasonable and not discriminatory, which is what FERC is approving. And I actually think maybe performance-based guidance from FERC that the industry could then use as a way to shape its more prescriptive standards might be a really interesting way forward.
Yeah.
So yes, Carrie, let's do it.
Angela, did you have your own question you wanted to answer?
Yeah, it's about your
Wait,
second.
Yeah, it's about this nice graph where you show like regulation and jurisdiction in this sector. And it's been a huge debate, the role of the EPA through the Clean Air Act. So, and how, I mean, normally this was a way that to regulate power plants. It's been challenged, but so is it, I mean, what are your views on this debate that is so hot right now?
Oof. Okay, so for those who haven't been following this part of the story, yesterday the Supreme Court heard, yeah, are we good? Oh, sorry, you want me to?
Yeah, you can, yeah, go anywhere you want to go.
Okay, are we talking about, you talking about this, my messed up slide? Yeah? Okay, so yesterday the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in a case that basically asks, like, how much authority does the EPA have to regulate power plants? And it's interesting, right? Like the way that the energy sector has long approached environmental regulation is that it's like, it's just an input. It's just something that happens over there and then like it acts on the system, right? And I think what you've seen though is that as we've had the EPA, I mean, this debate really started in the early 2000s with the Bush administration not wanting to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, being forced to by a Supreme Court decision in 2007. And then basically we've had like a huge policy flip-flop legal kerfuffle ever since, right? That's 14 years of that, 15 years of that at this point. And so I think what you've seen is that states in particular have decided to internalize environmental goals into energy law with their clean energy policies, right? Like, I think there was a hope for a while that the EPA would just regulate power plants, put some parameters in place, and that would drive system change. And when you haven't seen that, you've seen the energy policy community itself start to ask, like, well, what do we really want this to be like an external thing that's going on and being driven by air regulation? Or is there a way to just sort of like go out and substantively adopt and try to achieve our own goals for what we want the system to be? So, I mean, I think those two can work in concert. I think if you talk to environmental law scholars, there's a lot of despondency about what's going to happen with the EPA's Clean Air Act authority to regulate carbon from power plants. And so I wouldn't want to be leaning on that as my primary way to sort of squeeze this system.
Oh, that's a grim answer.
But states are really doing a lot, right? Like the stat that I enjoyed quoting in an earlier presentation, and I don't know if I'm going to get it quite right here, is there was a report that came out maybe at the end of 2020 from the Luskin Center of UCLA. And it was something like 1 in 3 Americans now lives in a place that has a 100% clean energy goal or mandate, right? So it's not happening through the EPA, but it's not happening. It's just we're finding different ways.
Such a Hamiltonian. Did you want to ask a question? Oh, you were asking for, yeah. I'm kidding. Is there a question in the room? Yeah. You guys, sure? Okay.
So it's this one,
All right.
the role of nuclear.
The role of nuclear, I could probably guess if that's what it is. When you said nuclear, I think I know what the question is. Where do you see nuclear fitting into the future? Nuclear plants provide firm generating capacity, and next generation nuclear plants, if they ever get built, will likely have some load following capability. However, nukes cost a fortune to build. How do the costs of building local nuclear compare to the cost of building thousands of miles of transmission to move renewable power into the Northeast and millions of megawatt hours of storage to carry through a week of cloudy doldrums?
Yeah, I mean, like, would that I had the crystal ball to answer this question. I'm definitely not the cost expert here. You know, I'm from South Carolina, so we are an interesting case study in nuclear energy right now. We decided back in 2007 to pass a law that basically told our utility that we the ratepayers would pay them to build a new nuclear plant or add-on, and no matter what it cost, or even if they had to abandon it, they were guaranteed full cost recovery. We now have, two $9 billion holes in the ground in South Carolina and 0 megawatts of additional power coming our way. And I mean, you translate that to electricity bills. I haven't seen the latest numbers, but a while ago, it was every South Carolina household paying $28 a month for these 2 holes in the ground. So, you know, there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle as to what went wrong there, but I think it has left those in the state and those that are following the controversy with, you know, big questions about the economic feasibility of nuclear. And I think that there's a lot of ways in which nuclear technology could advance and get more modular and get next generation where it would make a ton of sense. I don't think that we should quit doing R&D and attempted commercialization of those technologies. But I'm not ready to put a lot of eggs in the basket. And maybe it's just because I've lived through what I've lived through in the state and seen what it's done to the state. So, you know, it's an open question. I think it has a ton of promise as a technology. And the question is like, does it have a ton of promise economically and in terms of like real world regulatory constraints and litigation constraints, et cetera?
Susanna.
Yeah, I'll ask a question. I guess I want to ask, what do you think of the Green New Deal? But that's such a big question that instead, I'm just curious if there's any particular specific details of it that you think help us get towards what you've been talking about today. If there's anything that you're like, oh, this is a particularly interesting piece that kind of overlaps with this in a way.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think if I had to say what I like best about the Green New Deal overall, and this is only tangentially related to what I've been talking about today, it's that I think what proponents of the Green New Deal are trying to do that has potentially a lot of promise is to turn climate change from like this massive problem that's going to descend upon us and have to be dealt with into an opportunity for like real, durable, lasting change in the American social fabric and in problems like inequality and structural racism, right? Like to make climate change an opportunity to link infrastructure change and social change, I think has a lot of power, right? And so like, I've kind of bookended my talk with some of those ideas because I do think like part of it is how we talk about what we're doing in the system, right? Like we can think of it in these very technocratic terms, and we often do, but like, I think part of what regulators and lawmakers need to do in this space is like make clear what we're doing when we're doing infrastructure change, which is making enormous impactful decisions about the shape the country is going to take for the next 50 or 100 years. So I really like the Green New Deal for trying to do exactly that. The other piece of the Green New Deal that I'm quite interested in is, I mean, I think that a lot of what they're calling for is essentially around this movement towards energy democracy and involving people more in the energy system. Right? And this has long been a space that's just been very closed to public participation. Like, who wants to go to an RTO meeting? So
Need to.
I think, so I mean, as we get to this place where people are linking infrastructure and social challenges much more, I think one of the questions I have is like, what kind of opportunities do we want to create for democracy to have more of a role in this space while avoiding these kind of like main votes to block the transmission line that would bring renewables from Canada to lower New England challenges? And I think this is like a pressing research question for people that are interested in energy governance.
And I guess the last question here. Thank you.
Hi, I don't even know how to ask this one. So it seems to me like money is the biggest problem to all of our problems, you know, all the solution to all of our problems and the problem of all of our problems, the cause of all of our problems. The reality that solar energy is now so cheap and getting cheaper all the time that the biggest, especially at the grid scale, the biggest cost of solar development now is the land. And so we have people developing plans for overbuilding solar and wasting energy, which we've never had before because it's so cheap. And so we get to the point where clean energy is cheap. It's just cheap. And how far are we, do you think, from legislators and policy developers just not even having to believe in climate change or the imminent danger that we're all in, but just the reality that clean energy is just the cheaper, financially more responsible option for creating energy going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the US South, and again, you've seen the dynamics change rapidly there from a place where utility regulators, all they want to say when you talk about solar is it doesn't shine all the time, to the point where they are really starting to understand that like economically, this could be really good for their states, especially for things like bringing in new industries and keeping electricity bills low. So I think it's important. I think it's a real dynamic. The modeling that I've seen, again, I don't have it totally at the top of my head, but essentially suggests that like cost is going to drive system change at a rate of something like 2% per year. And that's fantastic and good, but not enough, right? So like, I think cost is not an impediment anymore, but nor is cost differential alone likely to create the kind of decarbonization that we need to see to hit scientific targets. So I think there's a gap between the sort of like hopeful cost story and the climate imperative. So is that part of the marketing gap, or is it like why are there things we do marketing and that gap and make that 2%, 5%? I mean, I would say it's largely a law and governance gap, but marketing and messaging might help you get the law and governance that you need, right? So it's not disconnected.
Yeah. And I think it is the best part of the story is at the generation is about generation, right? But the rest of the system kinds of costs, especially not just, the inverter, but now the real kind of national scale balance of system costs are these huge things that are bound up in rules and power and not falling costs. So I think that's where it is, right?
Thanks.
Great. Okay. Without a call for, nope. Good. Great. Terrific. Thank you very much, Shelley.
Thank you all so much.
It's over here. I've got a couple of announcements about next time for all of you. And I know the dates, I know the names, but I don't remember the dates. So on March 15th, we'll have Ann Alhoff, who's an international policy advisor to the UN, famous for kind of shepherding the periodic emissions gap reports out of the UN. She'll be speaking about the global emissions with the latest data under the Paris Agreement. Fantastic speaker, really great leader in that space. And then in April, of course, we're looking forward to hosting another Energy Week at Penn and our 7th annual Carnot Prize, which this year we are very excited, for those of you who haven't yet heard, and I hope it's none of you, is going to Lord Nicholas Stern, the author of the Stern Report. And takes a backseat to no one on sustained scholarship on this very important area. So I hope you'll join us for that. You can register at our website. Thanks for coming and see you next time.